Hello everyone and welcome to the RAF Museum's Research Lecture Series. I'm really pleased with the lecture that we are hosting tonight, which is on the Jewish Chaplains of the Royal Air Force in the Second World War. It's a topic which I think is fascinating, and I'm going to hand over to our speaker in a moment. But can I begin by saying thank you for all of you who are joining us from around the world. It's always a pleasure to engage with a global audience, so wherever you're joining us from, welcome. And allow me to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Jonathan Lewis, who studied law at Cambridge and spent his career as a lawyer and a judge. In retirement, he researched and was awarded a doctorate by the University College London on Jewish Chaplaincy in the British Armed Forces from its inception in 1892 until the present day. His book on this subject has been published, and we'll be sharing the link after the lecture, and it is available on the front page of this crowdcast session, I think. And he lives in London. He's married with 2 sons and 2 granddaughters. So congratulations, Jonathan. I'm really looking forward to tonight's lecture. So take it away.
Thank you, Han, very much indeed. And good evening, everybody. Welcome. Thank you all very much indeed for coming. Might I ask people to bear with me for just 1 second, please? Thank you very much. How did I come to this subject? Well, Han has very kindly explained. When I retired from my job, I started researching for what became a PhD at University College London on the topic of Jewish chaplaincy in the British Armed Forces. I discovered that absolutely nobody had researched this, and there was next to nothing written on it. Somebody very kindly told me in the course of my research that I'd become the expert on this subject, to which I said, well, thank you very much, but there's really not a lot of competition. Anyway, the work has reached fruition, as Han said, in the form of a book, which I'll mention when we get to the end. It was in the course of this research that I came upon the Jewish chaplains who served in the Royal Air Force in the Second World War, and it's those whom I'd like to speak about this evening. So very briefly, by way of background, Jewish chaplaincy begins in Britain in 1892. In both world wars, Jewish army chaplains served in virtually all of the theatres of war around the world. By the end of the First World War, there were 20 Jewish chaplains serving with British forces, all army, together with 3 Australian Jewish chaplains, in those days effectively under British chaplaincy command. The Second World War saw by the end a total, on my count, because I couldn't find a complete list anywhere, of 56 Jewish chaplains, including 7 in the Royal Air Force. We'll speak about them this evening, and then about broader aspects of Jewish chaplaincy in the RAF. I've discovered more about some of them than of others, but I'm afraid not very many photographs. Han, if we might have the next slide, please. We'll begin in Britain with Reverend Jacob Ferber, 1909 to 1998. He was born in Riga in Latvia, and he was brought to England at the age of 3 months. He lived in Manchester and then in London, and he studied in what's called a yeshiva, that's a religious college, called Eitz Chaim, which means Tree of Life, yeshiva. He ministered to an evacuee community in Marlow in 1941 and 42, and then in Cheltenham. He became an RAF chaplain based at West Drayton. He was married with a daughter. After the war, he served communities in Hounslow, East Ham, and Manor Park and Wanstead and Woodford, and retired in 1974. We also have Reverend Ruben Abenson, who was born in 1910. He was from Llanelli. He was appointed an RAF chaplain in July 1944 and served in Britain. Those are the two chaplains who served in the RAF in the Second World War and did not travel abroad. Han, if we could have the next slide, please. Having travelled back in time to World War II, I'd like us now to board a notional troop transport for the Middle East, where we're now going, where we're meeting Rabbi Israel Brodie, 1895 to 1979. Rabbi Brodie's father, Aaron Brodie, arrived in Newcastle upon Tyne from Kovno in Lithuania in around 1890 and somehow made a living as a peddler selling sponges. He and his wife Shina had 5 children. The second child, Israel Brodie, was educated at Bath Lane School in Newcastle, what was then called Jews College, which exists today as the London School of Jewish Studies, University College London, and Balliol College, Oxford. In March 1916, he became the minister of the new synagogue in Newcastle and later served at Hammersmith Synagogue in London. In August 1917, Israel Brodie was conducting military services at Aldershot. He was commissioned as an army chaplain in January of 1918, and he served in France from the 8th of January 1918 until 1919. He then returned to Balliol College and did congregational and welfare work in the East End of London. In 1923, he went to Australia, where until 1937, he ministered to the Melbourne Hebrew congregation. Returning to Britain, he studied at Oxford for a D.Phil, worked in the East End of London, and from 1939 until 1948 served as a tutor and lecturer at Jews College. In December 1939, Brodie rejoined the army as a Jewish chaplain, and on the 2nd of April 1940 he embarked with the British Expeditionary Force for the continent. He attempted to arrange Passover services, they're called Seder services, held on the first 2 evenings of the festival of Passover, Pesach, for the troops, including services for 200 or 300 men of the pioneer companies who were serving with the British Expeditionary Force. He was on the beaches at Dunkirk for 4 days, dive-bombed by Stukas, before arriving back in the UK on the 29th of May 1940. He was so shattered mentally that he had to spend time with his brother who lived in Leeds. He'd lost all his kit and his brother helped him to buy a new uniform. Rabbi Brodie then served as a chaplain with Southern Command at Aldershot and then within Scottish Command. On the 10th of December 1940, he was, in military speak, translated into the RAF as its first Jewish chaplain, with a relative rank of squadron leader, and he was later appointed the Jewish chaplain in RAF Middle East. He served in the Western Desert, later becoming Senior Jewish Chaplain in RAF Middle East and being mentioned in dispatches. In London, the overall Senior Jewish Chaplain, Rabbi Mark Gollop, had to stand down in December 1943 through illness. And after a selection process, Israel Brodie was selected to succeed him. Senior Jewish Chaplain overall had to be army. And so on 15th March 1944, Israel Brodie was duly, one could say, retranslated back into the army to become the Senior Jewish Chaplain, in the acting rank of Chaplain 3rd Class and the local rank of Chaplain 2nd Class, which Gollop had held, with the equivalent rank of Lieutenant Colonel, but it's recorded on the pay still of a Chaplain 3rd Class. As the Senior Jewish Chaplain, he was correspondingly appointed the Army Chaplain in charge of Jewish interests in the Air Force, and he took Mark Scallop's place on what was called the Interdenominational Advisory Committee on Army Chaplaincy Services. As Senior Jewish Chaplain, he visited troops in November 1944 in Europe, in March 1945 in Italy, in August 1945 in the Far East, and in September and October 1945 in Germany. In June 1946, he married Fanny Levine. There were no children. Chief Rabbi Joseph Hertz had amazingly been Chief Rabbi from 1912 until he passed away in 1946, and thus through both world wars. And after his death, Brodie was selected to succeed him as Chief Rabbi in 1948. He therefore stood down as Senior Jewish Chaplain and left the army in June 1948. He retired in 1965, he was knighted in 1969, and he died in 1979. Han, may we have the next slide, please? The picture is of Reverend Eli Cashdan, 1905 to 1998. One of 5 children born in Minsk, Eli Cashdan was brought to Britain at the age of 3 months. He was educated at Liverpool Hebrew Higher Grade School, Liverpool Yeshiva, and Jews College, where he studied Semitics, and at London University, where he studied the English, Jewish, and Roman legal systems. He married Minnie Cohen, and they had 2 children. He qualified in 1933 as a barrister and practiced from Lincoln's Inn in London, leaving the bar in 1938 to become an education officer. In December 1941, Eli Cashdan applied to serve. He was appointed on the 8th of June 1942 to fill a vacancy for an RAF chaplain in the Middle East, with a relative rank of squadron leader. Whereas Israel Brodie had been translated into the RAF from the army, Eli Cashdan was the first Jewish chaplain to be commissioned directly into the RAF. From November 1942, he served throughout the Middle East, including Amman, Cairo, Tehran, Saudi Arabia, and Persia. He encountered thousands of Palestinian Jewish soldiers and conducted Passover and High Holy Day services for over 1,000 troops. When Israel Brodie returned to London in the autumn of 1943, Eli Cashdan became the Senior Jewish Chaplain to the RAF in the Middle East, in the relative rank of Wing Commander. He remained in the Middle East until at least August 1946 and left the RAF in that year. He worked for a publishing house and as a tutor and lecturer at Jews College, and retired in 1975. Rabbi F.G., I don't know his first name, Nathan, who died in 1977, I don't know his year of birth, was from Jerusalem, and he was one of 12 Jewish chaplains who were locally recruited by the British from amongst some 30,000 Jews living in the British Mandated Palestine, who served with British forces. He served for some time in the RAF before being appointed in around May 1943 as the 3rd RAF Jewish chaplain in Middle East forces. After the war, he became a leading figure in tourism in Israel. He served in the office of the Prime Minister of Israel, and he was active in the Israeli branch of the Royal Air Force Association. Han, could we move to the next slide, please? If we could now board our troop transport again we're going to travel to the Far East to meet Sebastian Morton, always known as Sonnie Bloch, 1919 to 1979. He was the second of 7 children, 5 boys and 2 girls. His paternal family was of a long rabbinic line. His grandfather was the first rabbi in Sunderland, to which the whole Jewish community of a town called Kretingan in Lithuania had migrated in the late 19th century. The Amersham Hebrew congregation was one of a number of Jewish communities which came into being amongst people who had sought the relative safety of the home counties from the bombing of London during the Second World War. At different stages, it had 3 Jewish ministers. One of them was Sonnie Bloch, who had not in fact been ordained as a minister, but served in that capacity for 4 years. Bloch rode a motorbike and was remembered as the motorbike Rev and the rabbi in the green jacket, because he wore a green jacket. Bloch was appointed an RAF chaplain in July 1944. Although he was not ordained, he was accorded within the RAF the courtesy title of Reverend. He served with the 12th Army in Southeast Asia Command as an RAF chaplain from August 1944, ultimately in the relative rank of wing commander until 1948. From Sonnie Bloch's family, I have a couple of nice anecdotes. One is that one evening in Burma, Bloch's unit was camped out in tents with the Japanese army close by. Bloch was so tired that he told his batman not to wake him up in the morning. When he awoke, he was dismayed to find himself alone and the camp deserted. Suddenly, a jeep came roaring into the camp. With a big grin, his batman asked him, "Did you have a good sleep, sir?" Bloch never gave such an order again. On one occasion, Bloch was on a plane transporting military personnel in the Far East. The plane had already started moving down the runway when the pilot apologized that they had to await an urgent parcel for Wing Commander Bloch. A motorbike approached and delivered the parcel. As the plane took off, everybody was intrigued to know what parcel could have been so urgent as to delay a troop transport. Opening it, Bloch was embarrassed to discover a knitted woolly bear made by his mother to maintain his spirits. Good-humoured banter accompanied him for the rest of the flight. Bloch was with Allied forces when they entered Japan, soon after the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. He welcomed to dinner 2 Jewish soldiers from London who had been prisoners of the Japanese for 3.5 years. Bloch's post-war visiting card described him as Jewish Chaplain, Far Eastern India, based at the RAF base at Singapore. He conducted Passover Seder services in India and in the Far East. In 1948, there was a party to celebrate the creation of the State of Israel. Because this marked the end of the unhappy British mandate, Bloch was ordered not to use the word Israel, which proved challenging. Released from the RAF and returning to Britain towards the end of 1948, Sonnie Bloch met and married his wife Phyllis. To the end of her days, she would never speak of the highly secret work which she had done during the war. They had 4 children. Bloch worked for a while in Israel and then returned to Britain. He died in 1979 of leukemia at the age of 60. Whether that was related to his having been in Japan after Hiroshima cannot be known. He was a leading member of Stanmore Synagogue, where I grew up and attended as a child, and I have clear memories of him. And if we could please move to the next slide. if we can board our time-travelling troop transport again and travel now to Europe, we can meet Reverend Dr. Louis Maurice Sanker, who was born in 1909. Louis Sanker was the minister of the Bristol Hebrew congregation. He was appointed a Jewish chaplain in the RAF with effect from the 1st of September 1944. A year earlier, in September 1943, he had been the subject of a complaint. Its substance is not recorded, but it was concluded that he was entitled to an apology. On 17th November 1944, he was appointed the Senior Jewish Chaplain to the 2nd Tactical Air Force Rear, in the relative rank of squadron leader. On 27th November 1944, Reverend Isaac Levy, who by that time was the Senior Jewish Chaplain in Europe, with as it was then known, the British Liberation Army, the BLA, escorted Louis Sanker and visiting Senior Jewish Chaplain Israel Brodie to a former concentration camp. When Levy had previously visited it, it had been occupied by British troops. Now it was entirely empty, and so seemed even more gruesome. Eerie and ghostly it all was, Levy wrote. Levy visited another concentration camp near the town of Vught in Holland, and on another occasion took Brodie and Sanker there. In December 1944, Sanker, together with the local rabbi, held a Hanukkah service in Eindhoven for service personnel and the local Jewish community. Hanukkah is a Jewish festival which falls normally in December. On the 31st of December 1944, Levy held a conference of Jewish chaplains in Brussels to discuss arrangements for the forthcoming Passover. To Levy's irritation, Sanker declined to cooperate in the arrangements, saying that he must be with the greatest number of RAF men. Levy recorded that in Brussels, Sanker had sought to establish himself as a sort of saviour of Belgian Jewry, suggesting the evacuation of children in response to a slight breakthrough by the Germans. Levy noted that were this to become known to the authorities, it would result in a serious reprimand, but Levy was unable to intervene, as although he was the senior Jewish chaplain in Europe, the RAF was not under his jurisdiction. He considered that former senior Jewish chaplain Mark Gollop had been right to refuse to have Sanker commissioned, despite the desperate shortage of chaplains. If that's right, it may explain why Sanker had presumably applied to join the RAF. Bergen-Belsen concentration camp was liberated by the British Army on the 15th of April 1945. Sanker arrived there about 10 days later and spent a week there. He arranged for Air Force units to contribute everything that they could spare to alleviate the indescribable suffering which the British found, and vast quantities of food and supplies were donated. One RAF VR squadron went on biscuits for 2 days to allow the white bread to go to Belsen. Reverend Leslie Hardman was the first Jewish chaplain to arrive in Belsen on the day after its liberation and did heroic work there. Louis Sanker took him to a Royal Canadian Air Force unit, and after Hardman had talked with their officers, the medical officer ransacked his whole medical room, and the officers contributed and sent in truckloads of food and medical supplies. In May 1945, Sanker arranged and officiated at a service of praise and thanksgiving for the victories of the Allied nations in Brussels. After service in Europe, he served in Gloucester, leaving the RAF in April 1947. In 1950, he was serving as the minister of the United Hebrew Congregation in Leeds. Han, if we could please come to the next slide. We don't have anywhere now to travel, but we'll speak about Jewish chaplaincy more broadly. There were, as I say, on my count, 56 Jewish chaplains who served in British forces in the Second World War, including 12 from the Jewish community in Palestine. This group photo was taken at a conference in April 1941, before some of them went abroad. The man sitting third from the left as we look at the photo, the older man, is Rabbi Mark Scallop, the senior Jewish chaplain. I know who all the chaplains in this photo are, and as you can see, they are all army. Han, if we may come to the next image, please. From London, the Jewish chaplaincy organised visitation to Jewish soldiers and airmen serving on army bases and RAF stations around Britain. They established a card index system recording every visit to every serviceman. The card that we're looking at is the card of my late father of blessed memory, Harold Lewis, who, as you can see, served at RAF Bicester and then RAF Hanwell. It records visits to him by chaplains and the Jewish books which they gave him. In March 1941, the Jewish Chronicle published one of a number of long articles by another army chaplain, Rabbi Louis Rabinowitz, entitled More Experiences of a Jewish Padre. Amongst the experiences that he narrated were of a Jewish sergeant gunner in a bomber who, having made 38 landings, feared that he would not make many more. Rabbi Louis Rabinowitz talked and prayed with him before, on the following day, he went out on a raid and did not return. Han, may we have the next slide, please? Later in the war, between April 1944 and November 1945, synagogues were opened and consecrated at 5 RAF stations by Senior Jewish Chaplain Israel Brodie, together with other chaplains, including on 2 occasions the Chief Rabbi. They were RAF Mildenhall in Suffolk, Cranwell in Lincolnshire, Henlow in Bedfordshire, and Sealand and Kirkham in Lancashire. At some of the stations there were regular services, Jewish educational courses, and Jewish clubs. At RAF Mildenhall, Flight Lieutenant Julian Missel held regular weekly services. Leading aircraftman Schoen conducted them, and leading aircraft woman M. Sefton became what was called the mother of the congregation. On the first anniversary of the synagogue at RAF Mildenhall in May 1945, a Thanksgiving service was held. At RAF Sealand, there were literary and social evenings on Mondays, and the president of the congregation, Corporal Abe Grabman, started the first official RAF language course in modern Hebrew, with 18 airmen and airwomen attending the opening lecture. Flight Lieutenant Cyril Galkov was a dental officer who was a lay reader and the liaison officer for Jewish matters at his RAF station in England, where he organised and conducted regular Friday evening services. He presented a portable ark and a silk curtain to house the scroll of the law, the Sefer Torah. Reverend Saul Amias took it to camp services, and he and Senior Jewish Chaplain Israel Brodie attended the formal presentation. Men of the US 8th Air Force made their own miniature ark and appurtenances for holding services at their station. At one RAF station, 2 aircrew were detailed on the morning of the fast day of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, for an operational mission. Because it's a fast day, they forewent the special operational meals to which they were entitled, carried out their mission, and returned to the Yom Kippur service. From 1944 until the present day, the Jewish Chaplaincy has conducted courses of religious and moral instruction, combined with social activity, for Jewish personnel. Moral leadership courses, as they ultimately became known, originated in the RAF. They were proposed in 1941 because of concern about the state of religious welfare in the RAF, and there were experimental courses in 1942. They were then known as courses in religious training or courses of instruction, and were held under the auspices of different religious denominations. The first courses were held by RAF Mediterranean and RAF Middle East commands from August 1944 in Ramallah, Jerusalem, and Ismailia. The first course for Jewish personnel in the RAF and the air forces of other Allied nations was held in August 1944 at a place called Kfar Hanua Hadati in Palestine and lasted for a week. In Britain, a series of moral leadership courses for Jewish members of the RAF and WAPS was initiated in November 1944 by Senior Jewish Chaplain Israel Brodie. In Palestine, Chaplain Eli Cashdan, whom of course we've met, organised in the summer of 1945 a Jewish moral leadership course for 25 airmen at Rehovot, and together with Palestinian Chaplain Nathan, whom we met, a course for British and Palestinian airmen in Haifa. Ever since then, courses have continued to be held by Jewish chaplains at numerous locations around the world. They continue until today with an annual residential weekend course for Jewish personnel. By the 1950s, the system of appointing lay leaders and preachers to assist chaplains still continued. In October 1948, there were Jewish lay leaders at RAF Credon Hall, Debden, Mildenhall, Padgate, Pembroke Dock, Stafford and Upwood. Station synagogues were consecrated in 1952 at RAF Stafford and RAF Yatesbury, and in 1953, together with a club room, at RAF Hensford. In 1954, there were synagogue clubs at RAF Cardington, Hensford and Yatesbury. To ease their integration, all RAF National Service conscripts who were Jewish were posted in the 1950s initially to RAF Hensford in Staffordshire, and then, when it closed in 1957, to RAF Bridgenorth near Birmingham. At times, there could be 80 or 90 Jewish personnel, and a synagogue and club room were opened at RAF Bridgenorth in 1957. Reverend Ruben Brooks, a civilian minister of Birmingham, visited RAF Hensford and later travelled every Thursday evening to RAF Bridgenorth to serve as what is termed an officiating chaplain, a civilian minister serving as a chaplain. If not otherwise required for duty, Jews who wished to attend synagogue on a Saturday morning were permitted to do so. RAF Bridgenorth closed in 1963, and all of the Jewish books and religious appurtenances were transferred to its successor training camp for recruits, RAF Innsworth. Flying Officer Gerald Rapport did national service from December 1959 to December 1961. As the officer in charge of Jewish personnel, he was regarded as an acting chaplain, in which capacity he shared a hut at RAF Bridgnorth with the Protestant and Roman Catholic padres. At RAF Abayet in the Canal Zone, Friday evening services were conducted in 1951 by Flight Lieutenant Bornstein and Lieutenant Wartsky. Han, if we may please come to the next slide. Coming to the present day, Reverend Malcolm Wiseman, who was born in 1930 and happily is still with us. Malcolm Wiseman read law at St Catherine's College, Oxford, and the London School of Economics. Married, he practiced as a barrister in London, sat as a recorder and an immigration judge, and served as a parliamentary boundary commissioner. In 1956, Malcolm Wiseman selected the RAF as his service and was commissioned as a chaplain. In the 1960s, he served as a part-time officiating chaplain to RAF stations in the UK and ministered to Army and Navy personnel. He also served as the minister to the numerous small Jewish communities in Britain and the Commonwealth, numbering over 100, and helped some of them to become established communities. And he also served as the Jewish chaplain of various universities. He became Senior Jewish Chaplain in February 1972 and was commissioned into the Territorial Army Volunteer Reserve as a chaplain 4th class in August 1972. He attained the respective relative ranks of squadron leader and major and was listed in the Navy list as officiating chaplain for the Royal Navy. In the 1970s, Malcolm Wiseman travelled some 12 to 15,000 miles a year, sometimes including 1,000 miles a week, on chaplaincy duties. He conducted numerous moral leadership courses around the world and prided himself on being the only person to have visited every British military base of all of the armed services around the world. During 1977, he established a Hebrew class at RAF Cranwell. The Handbook for RAF Chaplains required chaplains to report the names of all Jewish personnel who arrived in their unit to him. In 1997, Malcolm Wiseman was awarded the OBE for services to the Jewish community. Wiseman attended conferences of the North American and European Chiefs of Chaplains and of the Allied Air Forces Chiefs of Chaplains Consultative Committee, later serving for 11 years as its Secretary General and then as its Honorary Life President. He served as a member of the Advisory Panel on the Chaplaincy Services and as a member of the Consultative Committee of Senior Allied Air Force Chaplains, and he participated at conferences of the Jewish Welfare Board, Jewish Chaplains Council in the United States. Rabbi Samuel de Beck Spitzer was educated in London, Israel, and the United States, and was ordained as a rabbi in 2001. He has served communities in Lisbon in Portugal and in Hove in the UK, and is presently undergoing reserve officer training within the RAF chaplaincy branch. He will serve alongside currently 3 Jewish Army chaplains. And if we may please come to the next slide. Back in 1930, 92 years ago, Senior Jewish Chaplain Mark Scollop summarized in his annual report the role of Jewish chaplaincy. We share the sorrows as well as the joys of our flock, and by means of correspondence, I try to enter into the lives of the men who cannot be reached by personal contact. And perhaps we may claim the unique experience of ministering to a congregation whose members, although widely scattered over many parts of the globe on sea and land, yet receive most, if not all, the privileges and services to which any member of an organized Jewish community is entitled His words characterize the whole history of British Jewish chaplaincy. They are as true today as they were 92 years ago. Han, if we may please come to the next slide. In a moment, I'll be very happy to try to answer any questions that you may have. But just before I do, if Han, we might come to the next slide. Let me just tell you, if I may, about my book. It is called, as you can see, Jewish Chaplaincy in the British Armed Forces, Captains of the Souls of Men, 1892, when Jewish chaplaincy began, until 2021. There's a story about the phrase Captains of the Souls of Men. An Australian Presbyterian chaplain became a prisoner of the Japanese. And the Japanese had a lot of difficulty understanding what a chaplain was. They could see that he was treated with a certain deference. And at one point, they gave him an armband which he had to wear. It was a white armband with green Japanese characters. What they meant, he did not know. But when the Japanese told you to do something, you did it. His name was Alan Cunningham. He survived. And when he got back to Australia, the letters were translated for him as Captain of the Souls of Men. If I had to try and find one phrase to explain the role of a military chaplain, I could not improve on Captain of the Souls of Men. For anybody who would like to look at the book, it is available from the publishers Valentine Mitchell at a currently discounted price of £40 from the otherwise price of £50, together with postage and packing, on a link which is in the chat now, together with a code. There's also a paperback which is not yet available on Amazon, but which I have. That's available at £25 plus postage and packing. And if anybody would like to purchase that, please email me on my email address, which is there, and I'll be happy to come back to you. So maybe, Han, if we leave that screen up just for a little while, in case anybody wants that information. And if now, Han, people have any questions, as I say, I'll be very happy to try and answer them. So thank you very much, everybody.
Fine. That was brilliant, Jonathan. Sorry, I was just navigating my way to the unmute button and I kept on having a pop-up block me. But I really enjoyed the lecture. It's very poignant as well, particularly that ending line of the Captains of Souls of Men. And the book looks fantastic. I've not done a very good job focusing on the screen whilst we also talk, I'm afraid. But if you perhaps put your email address into the chat at the end of the lecture, then people, I'm sure, can email you if they want to take up on what seems a stonking offer. But if you want to get the hardback, that link is in the chat now. So I would encourage you all, if you're wanting to engage further with Jonathan's research after the Q&A, do follow that. But we have the delight of perhaps half an hour of questions with you, Jonathan. And I think one which always strikes me is underlying all of the Padres across the different denominations. What is the real importance to the men they engage with? And in the instance of Jewish chaplains in the RAF, do we have any sort of first-hand accounts of how important being able to engage with rabbis was?
Let me give you an answer to that. Han, could I have a copy of the book? My book. Han, if you would bear with me for one moment, I'd like to read you something which I think is the most articulate answer that I can give you. Here's just one instance. There was an army chaplain called Rabbi Leslie Edgar, who served in Britain and then in Europe with the British Liberation Army. And he later wrote an autobiography, and he wrote this: "Many times since the war, Jewish men and women have come up to me with their faces lit up with pleasure as they recognize their former chaplain. Indeed, sometimes the encounters take on a comic aspect. One day, after lunching with a friend at the Great Russell Hotel, I was standing on the hotel steps, chatting to him before saying farewell. A taxi drew up, and to my surprise, the driver got down from his seat, taking no notice of the 4 people in the taxi. He rushed up the steps of the hotel, almost embraced me, and when it was obvious that I didn't recognize him, said, his face registering great disappointment, 'But you were my chaplain in the army.' The sense of friendly relationship was so great that the fact that he was only one of thousands of men to whom I was chaplain did not occur to him at all." I think that's perhaps the best answer that I can give you.
Yeah, absolutely.
And perhaps I can just add one thing, Ham, which is this. The Jewish community has always been small, and the number of chaplains is correspondingly small. There were never remotely enough Jewish chaplains, and nor could there have been from such a small community. And so for Jewish chaplains, it was more a matter of trying to create relationships with Jewish personnel individually. For a non-Jewish chaplain, yes, personal relationships are very important, but they're ministering generally to a much larger congregation. And because the Jewish community is small, sometimes a Jewish soldier would already know a Jewish chaplain from civilian life before they met again on service. So personal relationships were important, and quite a number of people with whom I've spoken who in one or two cases served in the Second World War and in the other cases served as national servicemen remember their encounters with a Jewish chaplain and remember them warmly.
And what I was struck, as you mentioned that last one, the museum's archives has, I think, 1 or 2 examples of Jewish prayer books which were carried on service, and they're both they show the wear that they've had during their sort of their lifetime. I mean, I wonder. Obviously, individuals are different, but do you have a sense for the Jewish service personnel had a sort of particular, their faith was particularly important to them during this conflict, or as with all services, all faiths, was it just varying from individual to individual?
Yes, of course it did vary from individual to individual, and the religiosity of any given individual was his own. The Jewish servicemen were just like everybody else. They spanned the whole spectrum of religiosity, from the deeply religiously committed to the unknowing and indifferent. What one did observe is this, that in this country, when they were serving in this country in both world wars, often before going overseas, if leave was given, and it very often was given, for example, on a Saturday morning, for people to go to a local synagogue, if there was one, some people would go, and some people would go any other place that they weren't supposed to go. Once they were serving abroad, many people would make heroic efforts to attend a field service if they possibly could. And the army was extremely good, particularly in the Second World War, in doing their very, very best to lay on transport, even if it was for just 1 or 2 servicemen, to get them sometimes a very long distance to a service. The reality of mortality became much more real when people were actually abroad. And some people came to greater religiosity through that experience. Others went the other way. Some people lost their faith, particularly some of the soldiers to whom it fell to enter concentration camps, particularly Bergen-Belsen. And there were quite a number of, as it happened, Jewish personnel. Some became more religious, some became less as a result of their experiences.
Yeah, I think that sort of underscores again how important the role of the chaplains was. We've got some really good questions in from our audience. One of them is from Barbara Spence, who asks, why are some gentlemen referred to as Reverend or Rev and others as Rabbi?
That is a very good question, which it's very hard to answer concisely. It's all history. I'll try and explain it. The term reverend is of no Jewish significance. It's an Anglican term applied to members of the clergy, to clergymen. The Jewish term is rabbi. Rabbi means my teacher. People are ordained as rabbis by another rabbi. One rabbi confers what is called in Hebrew semicha, rabbinic ordination, on another. And the conferring of rabbinic ordination confers the right and the duty to give answers on questions of Jewish law to people within the community, for example, of a rabbi who address a question. There's a huge body of Jewish law, and it regulates the lives of observant Jews. And people very, very frequently have questions that they address to their rabbi. And prima facie, their rabbi's answer is binding. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the levels of religious observance of the Jewish community in Britain were generally low. Britain was known for lax levels of observance. And successive chief rabbis did their very best to introduce and impose and maintain religious standards. They therefore decided, as a matter of policy, to confine to themselves the right of a rabbi to answer questions, to give rulings on questions of Jewish law. And so the term chief rabbi was actually something of a misnomer, because for all practical purposes, they were the only rabbi. There were some rabbis who stood outside the British Jewish system and had come from places in Eastern Europe, but they were more independent, if you like. They were not within the mainstream of the British Jewish community. Ministers were, of course, educated and trained, and Jews College, as it was then known, now the London School of Jewish Studies, was established for the very purpose of training ministers. And ministers emerged from Jews College with the Anglican term reverend. It was part of a process whereby the Jewish community created structures modelled on the structures of the wider British community. So, for example, the Board of Deputies of British Jews was modelled upon Parliament. The United Synagogue, as it's called, was modelled loosely upon the Church of England, and so on. So, remarkably, until the 1950s, when I was growing up as a boy, the majority of ministers were reverend, and they wore clerical collars of an Anglican nature. You noticed in that group photo, pretty much everybody was wearing a clerical collar. And they would often wear a bowler hat and carry a rolled umbrella. And they looked for all the world to be Anglican ministers. My minister at Stanmore, of blessed memory, was Reverend Chaitowitz. Until in the 1960s, he and other ministers were given some months of sabbatical leave to go to Jews College, from which they emerged as Rabbi Chaitowitz. And somehow we never, as teenagers, we never quite got used to the idea of rabbi. They stayed, to us they were always reverend. For some ministers, the extra struggle was a bridge too far. I mentioned Reverend Leslie Hardman, who did unbelievable sterling work in Bergen-Belsen. That's a whole story in itself, which I've written about. For him, it was a bridge too far. And somehow somebody wrote that the term reverend somehow suited him better. His strengths were pastoral, and he somehow seemed more comfortable in that role. So that's, I hope, not too long an answer to a very good question.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It actually leads on to this one, which is from Carol, who asks, looking at the photo of Reverend Eli Cashdan, I'm wondering whether it was required for a Jewish chaplain to wear a clerical collar. And is that again linked to that process?
Yes, it's the same point. That was standard attire. It was not compulsory, but virtually all ministers wore it. And of course, it immediately identified the person to everybody as a minister.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So Ian Pegg asks, how often were Jewish chaplains translated between services? And I have to say, I love that phrase.
Yes.
Somebody was translated into the RAF. That's brilliant.
Yes, it's army speak. I don't know if it's still used. The answer is that Israel Brodie is the only instance that I've encountered of that. And it happened for the very specific reasons that I mentioned. A senior chaplain was needed for the RAF in the Middle East. The chaplaincy in the RAF was entirely separate to that in the army, which is no longer the case, and is, looking back, seems very strange. But even the senior Jewish chaplain in London, Mark Gollop, who was, of course, army, seems not to have had control over the Jewish chaplains appointed to the RAF, which is probably why the chaplain whom we've mentioned applied to the RAF. So one needed a particular reason to be translated, and an even more particular reason, which was to, having been selected to become the senior Jewish chaplain, to be retranslated into the army. I'm not aware of any other situations involving Jewish chaplains.
Excellent. Okay, we've got a question here for someone who doesn't have a name, which is whether or not this event will be available afterwards as a recording, and it will be. So if you're watching and you'd like to share it, it's going to be at this same URL. So please do share it with your friends. And this is from T. It says, it's a fascinating talk. It's just moved. Chaplains have often been like counsellors. Would Jewish chaplains have also served service people of other faiths?
That's a very, very good question. Again, let me try and give you a short answer to it. Always, and especially today in our multi-everything society, chaplains have two roles. They have a narrower, if you will, denominational role, and they have a broader pastoral role. In the first role, the denominational role, they would never dream of attempting to minister to anybody of any other faith. And if a chaplain encountered a serviceman or woman in need of religious, specifically denominational religious counsel or guidance, he would refer him to the chaplain's appropriate colleague of that faith. Much more broadly, chaplains have always had, and they have to today, a pastoral role, a caring role. They stand outside the chain of command, which means that a serviceman or woman can approach them on almost anything. There are one or two exceptions today, like drugs, but on almost anything, confident in the knowledge that the information will not be passed up the chain of command without the serviceman or woman's consent. And so chaplains are pastoral guides and moral counsellors to everybody who seeks their guidance. There are lots, that said, some of those lines have inevitably to be compromised. I have, for example, the experience of a Jewish chaplain on a troop train of soldiers preparing to go abroad, where, if I remember, it was two Highland, not Jewish soldiers, said to him, "Padre, pray with us," and he did. Padres in the vicissitudes of war are called upon to attend to people who are seriously injured and perhaps dying. There are stories of Jewish chaplains who've recited the Lord's Prayer for a non-Jewish soldier who is dying. Funerals is another issue. Somebody mentioned the little prayer books. These were innovated in the First World War and revised and reissued in the Second World War. They're small enough to fit into the pocket of a battle dress, and they're key prayers and meditations, including a burial service. In the First World War, the first and the senior Jewish chaplain, Reverend Michael Adler, wrote out in English the Jewish burial service and distributed it widely to his Christian chaplaincy colleagues to enable them to conduct in English a Jewish burial service for a Jewish soldier. And that was done. Nobody knows how often, but probably many times. So in short, it's essentially a dual role, with the lines sometimes being crossed in extremis. For that reason, because of the religious flexibility, one might say, that this requires, not all ministers of every religion are suited to be military chaplains. There were some chaplains who did not succeed in being effective as chaplains, essentially because they couldn't leave behind, if you will, their ingrained denominational focus. So in all religions, not all ministers are suited by conviction or temperament to become military chaplains.
Okay, that's a really good answer to that question. Let me just tick it off. Brilliant. So I think, again, flows on from that last question, which is from Alan Ginman, who asks, oh, it's just moved again. Would Jewish chaplains have worked alongside their Christian counterparts, or did they work entirely separately? And I'm supposing because the Christian community would have been much larger in the armed forces, and more Christian padres would have been available, but it was quite common for them to work side by side. Is that right?
Yes, it is right, and of necessity so. For this reason, if you are a Christian chaplain of whatever denomination in both world wars, you were very probably attached either to a unit or to a field hospital, and you performed all your chaplaincy duties for the members of the unit or the patients of the field hospital, the vast majority of whom would have been Christian, even if they were not your particular denomination of Christianity. For Jewish chaplains, the problem always, from 1892 until today, has first been to find their flock, to find their Jewish soldiers. Why? Because almost always, in any given unit, there will be, let us say, 2, 3, maybe 4 Jewish soldiers amidst a much, much larger number of people who are not Jewish. So the chaplains first have to find their soldiers, their flock. That is compounded by the fact that in a mobile war, particularly in the Second World War, units were constantly on the move. And even if a chaplain had identified 2 or 3 Jewish soldiers in a particular unit, by the time he actually got to be able to go and visit them, chances were that the unit had moved on, probably quite a long distance. On top of that, in the First World War, none of the chaplains, other than Michael Adler, had transport. So on the vastness of the Western Front, and indeed other fronts, the chaplains were virtually immobile. They had to get around as best they could. And what they did was what came to be called lorry hopping. There were always huge amounts of transport moving, and the chaplains would just hitch lifts. And the drivers of the transports got to know the chaplains after a while, and they said, hello, Padre, you again. So they would lorry hop. Some of them in the First World War, remarkably, knew how to ride horses. And there were plenty of horses on the Western Front, and some of them were able to get hold of a horse sometimes and ride it. Sometimes there was a bicycle. And for the most part, the only pony that they had was Shank's pony, and they had to get around in the mud. In the Second World War, it was better, because in North Africa in particular, there was a lot of transport, and the chaplains, as a matter of fact, weren't entitled to a vehicle. Back in Britain, they couldn't just have indented for a lorry and got it. But out in North Africa and the Middle East, it was quite different. And Isaac Levy wrote in his diary, if you knew the right strings to pull, it was remarkable what you could get. Isaac Levy had several vehicles, the last of them a large desert-worthy lorry and a driver. But transport was still very, very difficult. And the overriding difficulty remained to find your soldiers. Today, of course, not in wartime, communications make it infinitely easier. You can communicate. But in the Second World War, it was post, such as it was, which was the only way of communicating. In the First World War, on the Western Front, religious services were fixed a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks ahead, and notices would be posted up. They'd be sent to all the units. There'll be a service on such a date in such a place at such a time, and please make every effort to get there. And Michael Adler created a card index system for Jewish soldiers. So once he knew them and knew their unit, he would send them a postcard, a pro forma postcard, completed with the details of the service. But the war being what it was, sometimes by the time the date came, that location was no longer available because the front had moved. So yes, this was all a problem, and the Jewish chaplains had to do the best that they could. Very interesting. Just to add one thing, people will no doubt have heard of Sir John Monash, who became the Australian Commander-in-Chief and who was Jewish. And he was very supportive of the activities of the Australian and indeed the British Jewish chaplains. And in 1918, he sent a message to one of whichever of the chaplains it was, saying that in 3 weeks' time, when it would be the Jewish New Year called Rosh Hashanah, you, the chaplain, will be able to hold a service in such a place. And that was a place that at that time was occupied by the enemy. So Monash knew that his battle plan meant that if all went to plan, by that time that location would be available. And indeed, Monash said that he would attend, although in the event, the exigencies of service prevented him from doing so.
I have to be honest, I didn't realise Monash was Jewish, so that's, as a sort of trivia point, fascinating for me. But when you were talking in your lecture, the point that I was really interested by was when the chaplains were in occupied Europe, now liberated, and dealing with the populace there and local the people there. What was their reaction like to the arrival of the service chaplains? I mean, having previously been hiding in many places, relatively few may have survived, but do we have accounts of how they were able to react meeting?
Yes, we do. I've encountered several, and yes, we do, and they are poignant. For example, there was one man in Europe who had survived in hiding in some sort of a hole, and he'd done his best to follow the Jewish calendar. For the festival of Hanukkah, which normally falls in December, which is an 8-day festival with lights. One light is lit on the first night of Hanukkah, 2 on the second, and so on. He would try and get his hands on something like a potato and carve a little aperture in it and get a drop of oil and somehow try and light that for a little while. And he did that when he was discovered, and he discovered Reverend Leslie Hartman. There's a most poignant story which just came into my mind, and yes, in quite a lot of good people in Germany and in Italy, non-Jewish people hid at great risk to themselves, not only people, but scrolls of the law, what we call Sifrei Torah. The Sefer Torah is the most precious object in Judaism. Every synagogue has at least one Sefer Torah, and the Sefer Torah is read from in Hebrew at Sabbath and festival services. And next to saving a life, the next most important thing in Judaism is saving the Sefer Torah. And as I say, some very, very courageous non-Jewish people went to the Jewish community when it was obvious what was happening and said, even if we can't save any people, we'd like to try and save your scrolls. And they did so. And as Italy and then Germany were liberated, such people emerged, and they would say to the British or Allied troops, "Can you find me? Is there a Jewish priest? I want to give back the Sefer Torah." In Italy, there was a town where this happened. It was liberated, and the synagogue, which had been desecrated, as virtually all synagogues were desecrated by the Nazis, was cleaned and tidied up and everything. And there was a dedication service using the scrolls of the law that had been hidden. And the person who had hidden them at great risk to himself came to the Jewish chaplains and he said, "Here are the scrolls of the law. I only have one request. Please may I attend the service of rededication." There were poignant stories like that.
Wow. I think that's a really nice place to end on, Jonathan. It's been a fascinating talk, and I'm really pleased to see that you've published your research, and hopefully you've got some more areas to go into, because it is brilliant, and you have opportunities to share it elsewhere. But for those who have joined us, you can purchase Jonathan's book either by emailing him to get the paperback, or via the link, which I've already shared again.
Jan, could I just say, I've put my email on the chat, and in answer to Jacqueline's question, yes, I will very happily be autographing the paperback. Excellent. And indeed, if anybody should buy the hardback, I live in Pinner, and we can arrange to meet. I'd be very happy to autograph that as well.
Brilliant. Well, I do hope that you have orders coming in, richly deserved, because it's clear the wealth of research which has gone into this. So before I thank you for a final time, can I thank our audience for joining us? It's been great to have such a sizable audience for this topic. We've had just over, I think, 70 people join us live. I'm sure we'll have more people join us for the replay. And do share the link to this lecture if you'd like people to watch the recording, which will be available almost immediately afterwards. But Jonathan, I really enjoyed it. I thought it was very fascinating. And as I said, the power of some of those stories is really, it's stark. It gets to you. So thank you very much. And yes, thank you everyone for joining us. So goodbye.
And thank you very much indeed, and to everybody.